All right, so now we're doing part B of the first problem, which is find better guess. Basically, we're just going to be returning what is the better of the two guesses as determined by the scoreGuess method that we wrote in part A. And then there are some tiebreaker rules that we'll get into, and then there are a couple of preconditions that it's guess 1 and guess 2 contain all lowercase letters, and guess 1 is not the same as guess 2. Let's go ahead and jump into the pseudocode first before we get to solving the problem. First, what we're going to need to do is find the score for guess 1, and then the score for guess 2. We need these in order to compare them. If the score for guess 1 is greater, return guess 1, right? Remember, we're returning a string here, so we're returning which is the better of the two guesses. So otherwise, if the score for guess 2 is greater, return guess 2. Cool. But what if their scores are equal? Well, if their scores are equal, that means that we go into these sort of tiebreaker conditions where we're going to be comparing the actual strings to each other lexicographically. If the scores are equal, compare the actual guesses to each other. And we'll sort of dive into how you can do that when we're turning the pseudocode into actual code. Once we've compared the two, if guess 1 is alphabetically greater, return guess 1. And then the other thing is if guess 2 is alphabetically greater, return guess 2. And there isn't the condition where if guess 1 and guess 2 are alphabetically the same, because one of our preconditions is that guess 1 is not the same as guess 2. All right, so that's about all the pseudocode that we need for find better guess. So let's go ahead and dive into the actual code. So finding the score for guess 1, very conveniently, you might recall that in part A, we wrote this scoreGuess method. So we can just use that. So it returns an int, so that's what we're gonna have the type of our variable be. So int guess 1 score is equal to, just call this method and passing in guess 1. Cool, so that's the score for guess 1. Then we do the same thing for guess 2. Guess 2 score equals scoreGuess guess 2. All right. And what's really great about the A/B test is you don't actually need to have gotten the points for part A to be able to use the method itself. So like assuming, let's say you had no idea how to do part A and you just wrote some code that doesn't work here. For part B, you can just assume that it will work and you can just make that assumption, which is pretty nice, right? So the points for part B aren't dependent on the points for part A in a way. Okay, so we've got these two ints, which represent our scores for each of these two guesses. So if the score for guess 1 is greater, so if guess 1 score is greater than guess 2 score, we just return guess 1, right? Remember, we're returning a string, so we're actually going to be returning the string itself rather than the score. That's that condition. Otherwise, if the score for guess 2 is greater, so if guess 2 score is greater than guess 1 score, then we will be returning guess 2, all right? So those are the first two conditions where we actually got a different score for each of the two guesses, but there is this third condition where the scores are equal. So at this point, we can assume the scores of the two guesses are equal. So now we need to compare the guesses to each other. If you're thinking to yourself, well, how would I do that? Something that's really cool is you have that quick reference included in your test packet, and there is a method called compare to, which will actually give you value based on the comparison of two strings. So this method returns an int, and let's just call this comparison. It'd be like guess comparison. Guess comparison, all right. And what we do is we call it on one string and compare it to the other. So let's just do guess1 dot compare to guess 2, all right. So what this returns is a value such that if guess 1 is lexicographically greater than guess 2, it'll return a value greater than 0. If guess 1 is lexicographically less than guess 2, it'll return a value less than 0. Otherwise, if they're lexicographically equal to each other, then it will return 0. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, what does lexicographically comparing it mean? Well, we're kind of going through the string letter by letter, and we're comparing the Unicode values. You don't really need to know this. All you need to know is like what compare to returns. And as mentioned, these two strings are not going to be the same, so we actually won't have a situation in which the guess comparison value is going to be equal to 0. Okay, let's go through these last two conditions. So if guess 1 is alphabetically greater, so that means guess comparison is greater than 0. We know that guess 1 is alphabetically greater, so we would be returning guess 1. If otherwise, guess 2 is alphabetically greater, so in this case, guess comparison is less than 0, we will return guess 2. You might notice that after this if statement, we don't really have any more return statements. This might actually, you might get an error here, so your compiler will be like, oh, well, like, let's say none of these are true. Could be possible, I guess. We're actually just going to want to strip out this if statement because these last two if statements are mutually exclusive, right? So it can't be the case that neither one is alphabetically greater than the other as per the preconditions, okay? We've written out this code. Let's go ahead and test it out on the method calls that were given in the example problem. If we have guess 1 is 10, and the score for that is 9. And then for guess 2 we have is nation, and the score for that is 36. Let's go through our cases here. So our guess score is 9 greater than 36. That is incorrect. So we move on to our next statement. Is 36 greater than 9? That is correct. So we would be returning guess 2, which in this case is nation. And you can see the method call return value, we do actually return nation in that situation. Now let's look at a somewhat more interesting situation where we have two guesses that will return, that have the same score. Okay, so is 9 greater than 9? No. Let's move on to the next statement. Is 9 greater than 9? Well, we just said no, so I'm going to say no. Then when we do the guess comparison of con and cat, what we're going to see is that even though this first letter is the same, we're going to move on to the second letter of the word, which is O versus A. And we're going to see that O is actually lexicographically greater than A. So in this case, we would say that guess 1 will be lexicographically greater than cat. What that means is guess comparison will be some sort of value greater than 0. So then what we'll be doing is returning guess 1, which is con, which is exactly correct. That is what the problem statement says. So if we get rid of the pseudocode, here is the code we end up having. We're comparing those two scores, and then if we see that they're the same, then we move on to, like I said, graphically comparing the two actual guesses themselves and returning whichever one is greater. Hopefully that helps, and hopefully you have a great rest of your day.